Hello and welcome to the briefing with me, Gloria De Piero. It's stormy out, so stay with me this hour as I bring you the latest from Westminster as MPs come back from their short recess. As the Prime Minister prepares to end all COVID restrictions in England, I'll be asking Conservative and a Liberal Democrat MP if this is the right time or a risk too far. We're discussing long COVID too and seagulls. Yes, you heard me right. But first, here's the news with Rosie.
Very good afternoon to you. It's just 1 minute past 12. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. A cabinet meeting in which Boris Johnson was due to outline his blueprint for living with COVID to his colleagues has been delayed now until later this afternoon. Ministers had been seen arriving in number 10 today ahead of the meeting, but it was reportedly postponed with short notice. The Prime Minister had been expected to remove all remaining domestic COVID regulations in England by the end of this week. The British Medical Association say scrapping mandatory self-isolation is an odd decision. Virologist Dr. Chris Smith says even without the legal restrictions, people should be encouraged to use common sense.
At the end of the day, if you've got gastroenteritis and norovirus, you generally don't go to work. You don't send your kid to nursery. There's no legal framework that says if you do, you're going to get prosecuted. That's what they're removing, the legal framework, but hopefully the learning, the common sense, the ability to make decisions and risk assess that we've actually become pretty good at doing over the course of the pandemic. That remains in play.
Well, union leaders have criticised potential government plans to charge for COVID tests, calling it an act of madness. The TUC is urging the Prime Minister to put public health first. They claim it will disproportionately hit frontline and low-paid workers during a time when the cost of living is rising. Business Minister Paul Scully says the £2 billion per month government spending on tests could be better used. Transport networks across parts of the UK are suffering further delays as Storm Franklin now hits the country. Yellow weather warnings are in place for England, Wales and the west of Scotland. Some train operators have asked passengers not to travel today because of the conditions. Environment agencies have also issued hundreds of alerts for flooding across the UK. US President Joe Biden has agreed in principle to talks with Vladimir Putin as long as Russia holds off on any plans to invade Ukraine. Well, the Kremlin says there are no concrete plans, but both leaders could meet in person or talk on the phone. Well, meanwhile, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has said the UK and its allies are stepping up preparations for the worst-case scenario. She warned that the West must make the cost for Russia intolerably high. Samantha de Bendon from Chatham House stressed the importance of talks between Russia and the West to prevent an accidental war.
The real danger that we have here now would be of war starting by accident. What I mean by that is you have these separatists who are not fully controlled by Moscow, who have their own so-called army, who've called for mobilization. If some, for want of a better word, hot-headed commander decides to start provoking Ukraine, which they are doing at the moment, there is shelling taking place. If this goes too far, the Ukrainians might have no other choice but to respond.
Australia welcomes tourists back today after nearly 2 years. Vaccinated travellers can now travel to the country after some of the world's strictest pandemic measures were finally lifted. Australian citizens and international students were allowed to return down under from November last year, but most tourists had to wait. Well, travel editor at The Independent, Simon Calder, made the journey. He says there were no tourists on his flight to Sydney and that paperwork might be putting people off.
I had to fill in an incredibly complicated form. I had to be double jabbed. I had to take a lateral flow test in the 24 hours before getting on board. Really tough stuff. They desperately need us back. It's a question of whether, having had that big keep out sign for a couple of years, people have kind of forgotten about Australia.
There's a new drive to help uncover Britain's working class history. Historic England have announced that local communities can apply for grants of up to £25,000 to fund research. Well, the aim is to look into everyday history in places like our railways, council estates and pubs. The project is the first of a series planned for the next 3 years, exploring the diversity of England's heritage. You're now up to date here on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head back to Gloria for today's briefing.
Coming up this hour on The Briefing, as MPs come back from recess, I'll have the latest news from Westminster. What's the mood like, and is the Prime Minister safe for now? The Prime Minister looks set to announce the end to all COVID restrictions in England. Despite the news of the Queen testing positive, I'll be asking a Tory and a Liberal Democrat MP if now is the right time to start living with COVID. And though many people bounce back quickly, over 1 million are suffering from long COVID weeks and months after the initial infections. I'm talking to Lib Dem MP Wendy Chamberlain about the need for more support for those affected. She has a parliamentary debate this week. We will also be discussing seagulls on the show. Yes, really? Can they be a menace? What do you think? Get in touch, send in your views and opinions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're edging towards 500,000 followers. Search GB News, or you can find us at youtube.com/GB News online. All that coming up. The Prime Minister is expected to announce the removal of the final COVID restrictions in England to MPs later, including the legal requirement to self-isolate if you test positive this morning. Cabinet was due to sign off on the plan, but that's been delayed at the very last minute, reportedly due to some last-minute wrangling over the plan. But there's no doubt that the move will be popular with many, including many Tory backbenchers who've been agitating for a more conservative policy agenda for Boris Johnson's government. Well, our East Midlands reporter, Will Hollis, has been out and about finding out what people think. And he joins me now from Nottingham. Will, good to see you.
Good afternoon. Yes, we're hitting that point in about a month's time when we reach that 2-year milestone of when we first went into COVID lockdown. I think that all of this that's been going on for the last couple of years, the pandemic, is often punctuated by these big milestones. When we saw when we first reached 100,000 deaths in the country, and now a lot of people will be looking towards this next milestone of, I suppose, completing the saga of what the pandemic has been. It's certainly something that seems to be on Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister's mind at the moment. The timing of why this is happening now is something that a lot of people will be speculating about, particularly people in the other major parties, in the Labour Party, of why is the Prime Minister right now trying to strip away all of these final restrictions, really the very bare minimum of restrictions. We've seen masks have now been taken away. You don't have to legally wear a mask in public transport. You don't have to legally wear it in a shop. Most people would refer to that as a bare minimum, but legally having to self-isolate for that 10-day period very much is kind of the final thing that most people would refer to as a COVID restriction. And I think a lot of people, from the people that I've been speaking to, are very keen to see that remain. What conversations are going to be happening inside of that cabinet meeting when it does appear to happen this afternoon, we can only imagine. We're going to have to wait till later in this afternoon when the MPs will be briefed on what Boris Johnson's plan is. That is what we're hearing, though, that all of the COVID restrictions will be stripped away. So that would mean you can have a positive test and then be able to go out into regular everyday life, out on the streets, out in a shop, without any threat of legal action. So that's what we seem to know right now. And from what I've been hearing on the streets of Nottingham, people are in two minds about that. But I think a lot of people are still very undecided as to what is the right thing to do right now.
It's time to move on because it's not going to go away. But on buses and enclosed environments, I think it's still a little bit uncomfortable for people, and even for myself, I feel a bit uncomfortable. But I'm vaccinated, so therefore I feel health-wise I'm okay, and we need to perhaps continue that moving on.
We have to live with the virus, but other thing, can we trust people not to infect other people? So it's a question of responsibility of other people. If they test positive or if they have symptoms, that they be very, very responsible, you know what I mean? So I think just showing a blank canvas out there could be a bit of a wrong message. I think there should be somewhere where people should be responsible, you know what I mean? But we can't guarantee that.
You can't keep going on forever isolating, but then again, if you don't isolate, then we're going to go on forever, aren't we, sort of thing. So I don't know what to I don't know how to come to an arrangement with that, to be honest.
I think they should still keep the rules going. You should still have to wear your mask and that. Because I would not go anywhere without it. Never do. And I think you should keep the rules going. Really do.
Dangerous. Utterly dangerous. You don't know who's got it. I mean, do you go around with a big notice on, I've got COVID? No, you don't. You self-isolate, you take yourself away and look after it, after yourself. I've done it.
Yeah, so we are still waiting on the fine details of what the Prime Minister is expected to announce this afternoon, but all of the headlines seem to be leading towards that he is going to announce that anybody with a positive test in the near future won't have to self-isolate for that 10-day period. When you were watching that little VT of people's opinions here in Nottingham, people do seem to be quite a little bit torn. They do agree that we have to start living with COVID, but they are also quite concerned about how people will take the responsibility for themselves, but also the responsibility for other people. Now, Labour, while they have saying that they have released their own plan for living with COVID, that they say is a little bit more cautious, they are recommending that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party tread carefully at this quite pivotal point. As I said, we've seen all sorts of restrictions start to be stripped away, and we do know that hospitalisations are a lot less severe. Case numbers do appear to be dropping down massively, and we are at around 90% of people above the age of 12 that have had their first COVID vaccine at least. But Labour is still saying one of the things that Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Minister, said earlier today on television is that right now we're at this point where we are 2-1 up, and we're just about to sub off our best defender. So is it the time to be making these sorts of announcements? Is it the time to be stripping away the very bare minimum of restrictions, or as some people might be critiquing, is this just a very convenient thing for the Prime Minister to do when we do have the Sue Gray report, when we are having such a focus on Boris Johnson's parties, or is it actually the best thing for the country to do? What we are going to have to do is wait a few more hours until Boris Johnson has had that meeting with his cabinet and then has briefed Parliament, and I think a lot of people in the news business, as well as a lot of people in society, will be watching with bated breaths to find out where we might go from here as the pandemic does continue.
And of course, we will on GB News bring you that statement live from the Prime Minister when it happens this afternoon. But Will, brilliant to hear those voices from Nottingham. Will Hollis there, thank you. The Queen has tested positive for COVID-19, according to Buckingham Palace, but she's said to be experiencing only mild cold-like symptoms and is planning to undertake light duties, according to officials. Our reporter, Elly Costello, has been following the story from Windsor Castle and has sent us this update.
We're outside Windsor Castle now, where we know that the Queen is isolating after testing positive for coronavirus, and she is also still undertaking light duties. We saw yesterday she congratulated Team GB's curling team for winning gold at the Olympics. So those are the sorts of light duties that we can expect the Queen to undertake in the next week. We know that she's also met with ambassadors on video link this week as well, and she's also, that red briefcase that we often see the Queen pictured with, she's also still able to go through the documents in that red briefcase and sign laws. That is what she does with every single law in this country, and she will continue to do so this week. So that's the sort of thing that we can expect Her Majesty to be doing this week as she stays in isolation in Windsor Castle. But this news will come as a great shock to so many people, and of course many people will be concerned as well. This is a woman who is 95 years old. She is 96 in April, and she had poor health before Christmas, but this statement from the palace is there to alleviate some of that concern. Let's share some of that statement with you now. It says that the Queen is experiencing mild cold-like symptoms, but does expect to continue light duties at Windsor over the coming week. It goes on to say that she'll continue to receive medical attention and will follow all of the appropriate guidelines. Well, great effort has gone into keeping the Queen safe during the past 2 years throughout the pandemic. She has spent a lot of time here at Windsor Castle in a bubble which has been deemed HMS bubble, and that is a group of about 20 staff members who have surrounded the Queen for the past 2 years. The image of the Queen at her own husband's funeral, sat alone, has become the image of the pandemic, and it's a symbol of self-sacrifice that the Queen, as so many did, to keep themselves safe. But royal sources have been telling me that the Queen was aware that she would test positive for coronavirus at some point. She hasn't tested positive so far throughout the pandemic, but in the past week, many people in HMS bubble have tested positive. Prince Charles, the son of the Queen, the heir to the throne, he tested positive on the 10th of February, and that was 2 days after he met his mother. And we also know that his wife, the Duchess of Cornwall, is still in isolation after testing positive too. So this is something that has been in circulation in the royal household. But I think the timing of this statement is very significant. It's very, very rare that we hear about the private medical matters of the Queen, let alone on the day when something happens. And the Queen tested positive yesterday, and we had a statement by lunchtime. And I think that was very intentional. It's very British. It's a very keep calm and carry on attitude from Buckingham Palace, and it's this message that the Queen is very much going about business as usual. They do not want anybody to panic. So yes, there is of course concern for our 95-year-old monarch, but the palace want us to know that she's in the best possible place, she's in the best possible care, and they're very much looking forward to the official Jubilee celebrations in June.
Elly Costello there. Next, I'll be asking Lib Dem MP Wendy Chamberlain if ending all COVID restrictions in England is a good idea. We'll also be discussing long COVID. She's got a parliamentary debate this week. 1.3 million people in the UK are still suffering long COVID after their initial COVID infection. But first, just how windy will it be today where you are? Let's find out.
Hello. Storm Franklin is clearing away, but we do still have a Met Office yellow warning in place until the early afternoon. Still very windy out there, and still the potential for damaging gusts through the late morning, early afternoon. There is that storm system starting to ebb away, and the isobars just slowly opening out. So the winds will continue to ease through the rest of today, but it's still going to be a very windy day. For many, it'll be bright out there this afternoon. Quite a bit of cloud over the Midlands, East Anglia through the early afternoon. A few showers likely here, but otherwise it is mostly dry and many places seeing sunny spells. But it is still windy. Those winds just continuing to ease down a little bit through the afternoon. Temperature-wise, double digits for many across England and Wales, and even further north, above average across Scotland. But obviously it doesn't feel that mild because it is still very windy. As the winds ease off further, we could see some pockets of frost across northeast Scotland. Turns quite chilly across eastern England overnight with clear skies, but the next set of weather fronts will move in from the west, bringing rain and drizzle, and eventually they'll start to lift the temperatures. So certainly in the west, we're well above freezing by dawn. But some more heavy rain and strong winds come into western Scotland in the morning. That rain will spread southwards, could be very heavy for a time across northwest England, North Wales, particularly through Tuesday morning's rush hour. That band of rain kind of eases off as it spreads southwards, so a spell of damp weather for the Midlands and then East Anglia in the southeast through the early afternoon before skies start to brighten and we see sunny spells. A few showers across western Scotland, in particular over the hills. There will be of snow here, but again, for many it turns quite bright, but still quite breezy in the afternoon. Through Tuesday evening, we'll see a few more of those showers coming into Northern Ireland, northwest England, particularly western Scotland, with more snow on the hills. Clearer spells further south, and the weather continuing to chop and change this week. It'll often be windy, but not as stormy. There'll be spells of rain, but also most of us will see some sunnier days as well. Goodbye.
I'm Liam Halligan. Join me every weekday at 1 p.m. for On the Money, your daily dose of economics, business and consumer news. I've got 25 years experience covering economics and finance. We hold grown-up discussions with a host of experts who really know their stuff. We can't buy gas and store it. That was a mistake, wasn't it?
I think it was a mistake.
Even you, Liam, don't have a crystal ball.
Inflation's a real threat.
Every weekday at 1, you're on the money.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. With the Prime Minister expected to announce a dropping of COVID restrictions in England, some are keen to remind us that the virus still remains a threat. Many of us have had COVID and got better quickly, but not everyone is so lucky. 1.3 million people in the UK are suffering from long COVID, and 2/3 of them say it affects their day-to-day lives. And with over 150 possible symptoms, it's not well understood or supported. Wendy Chamberlain is the Liberal Democrat MP for North East Fife, and she's leading a debate in Parliament this week on long COVID, and I'm delighted that she joins me now. Welcome to the show. You're very welcome. I think it's your first time on my show. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria.
So you have this very timely debate in Parliament this week on the recognition of long COVID. Tell me what you'll be asking of ministers.
Well, I'm very specifically looking at it from a DWP and work perspective. As a Scottish MP, health has obviously devolved, so I'm not looking so much at the health perspectives. As you rightly say, 1.3 million people have been diagnosed with long COVID, and there's a challenge there as we look to the PM's statement today on COVID and the potential risk to testing, is that we have people who contracted COVID during the first wave when mass testing wasn't available, and the actual definition of long COVID as it currently stands is that it cannot be attributed to anything other than COVID. But a lot of those people don't have actually a positive COVID test to back that up. Going forward, even mild cases of COVID can still cause long COVID and a number of symptoms. If people don't have a positive test, how can they then demonstrate that what they have is long COVID and get the appropriate support that they need?
Well, there's clearly a row going on within Cabinet about the cost of mass lateral flow testing, which we've all come to accept as a way of life, but it costs us £2 billion a month. The risk is clearly down. Is the government right to be moving away from mass lateral flow testing, in your view?
Well, you were talking about living with COVID, but the reality is we've been living with it for 2 years. And I think the test and trace, despite, as you would expect me as an opposition MP to have lots of issues about how the government has carried out that programme, but the testing and tracing, and importantly, the self-isolation has been part of that. Lateral flow testing gives people confidence, particularly if they're working in, for example, care homes or other settings, or visiting elderly relatives or those that are vulnerable. So I think we need to think very carefully about what removing that testing means for those groups and potentially the costs. I think the other thing to think about in terms of self-isolation is that people who are self-isolating, it's because we want to do the right thing and they want to prevent the spread. And potentially people who are in less secure employment, gig economy, zero-hour contracts, there could potentially be pressure on them to return to work too quickly, and then prevent that causes further spread of the illness. We've been very lucky with Omicron that it's not been as bad as feared, but there's nothing to suggest that there aren't other variants out there, potentially because from a global perspective, countries are not in as good a place as the UK in relation to its vaccine programmes.
The government says it wants to move to an attitude of personal responsibility rather than government diktat. That sounds like a position the Lib Dems should support. We can all take responsible decisions for our own benefit, can't we?
Well, interestingly, your reporter was out in Nottingham earlier, and I think people genuinely do feel quite torn. Yes, people want to do the right thing. People, to a large extent, absolutely have done. You know, the public have responded excellently to COVID generally. But I think these are some of the very foundational safeguards that the government has had in place. And I think we need to think very carefully about whether now is the right time to be doing that.
The government have briefed this morning their sort of messaging, if not the detail, and they say people should not totally throw caution to the winds. They acknowledge that COVID remains a dangerous disease. It would be unfair to characterise them as just saying, go on, crack on, it's Freedom Day, you can do what you like. They are urging responsibility still.
Well, they're urging responsibility while taking some of those safeguards away that you would expect responsible people, such as taking lateral flow tests, to take. I mean, for example, when I go to Parliament, my expectation is that I test before I get on the estate, and I do that at least twice a week, because obviously I'm in a place where the virus could spread very quickly. So for me, there's a bit of it doesn't quite match up, that messaging about personal responsibility, but actually giving the people the tools in order to be able to do so.
If older people and those with weakened immunity and some key workers like NHS staff, if they were still able to access tests, is that a sensible middle road on this?
I think we need to look at sensible middle roads. I entirely agree, Gloria. As I say, it feels at the moment that this decision, particularly the day after the Queen has tested positive for COVID, feels like this is the government potentially trying to detract from some of the other things that it's been dealing with, as opposed to taking the right approach in the middle during the pandemic. You know, when you look at some of the experts that have come out in relation to this, nobody is saying that this is exactly the right way to be going. And I think the government need to think very carefully if we're seeing disputes within the cabinet as well. It suggests that this isn't a uniform, universal approved approach from the government.
And you mentioned the Queen. She is 95, nearly 96. She's continuing with light duties. Arguably, we should all take a lead from her in a vulnerable category, but continuing to work.
Yes, it's about taking the appropriate conditions. If you are experiencing mild symptoms and you can continue to work and you have the opportunity to work from home, I think that's been the case for some time. But I think we also have to accept that this is still a condition that is still, people are still dying in relation to infections. And second of all, we know that people can contract long COVID from mild infections, and we still don't properly understand the wide variety of conditions that result from long COVID, or indeed have the right supports in place. And that's what my debate on Thursday will be talking about, ensuring that the DWP provides the right support, not just to people who can't work, but also to employers trying to support people back into work.
And finally, do you continue to wear a mask?
Well, I'm in Scotland, so obviously different rules in Scotland. I'm following the rules in relation to mask wearing, and I wear masks on the parliamentary estate because the recommendation is to do so. The expectation of parliamentary staff is to do so, and so therefore I think as an MP it's important that I set that example too.
Wendy Chamberlain, really good to talk to you today. I hope your debate goes well on Thursday, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Coming up, Conservative MP Scott Benton joins me in the studio in a moment. I'll be asking what he makes of the end to COVID curbs in England. And we're talking seagulls and just what a pest they can be. But first, here's the news.
Good afternoon, it's 12:30. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. A cabinet meeting in which Boris Johnson was due to outline his blueprint for living with COVID to his colleagues has been delayed until later this afternoon. Well, ministers, as you can see, had been seen arriving in Number 10 ahead of the meeting. The Prime Minister was expected to remove all remaining domestic COVID regulations in England by the end of this week. More on that as we get it. Now, union leaders have criticised potential government plans to charge for COVID tests, calling that an act of madness. The TUC is urging the Prime Minister to put public health first ahead of internal party politics. They claim it will disproportionately hit frontline and low-paid workers during a time when the cost of living is on the rise. Transport networks across parts of the UK are suffering further delays as now Storm Franklin hits the country. Yellow weather warnings are in place for England, Wales and Northern Ireland and the west of Scotland. Some train operators have asked passengers not to travel because of the conditions. Environment agencies have also issued hundreds of alerts for flooding across the UK. The US President Joe Biden has agreed in principle to talks with Vladimir Putin as long as Russia holds off on any plans to invade Ukraine. The Kremlin said the two leaders could meet in person or talk on the phone, but said there were no concrete plans yet. Well, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is warning an invasion of Ukraine looks highly likely by Russia, and the UK and its allies are stepping up preparations for the worst-case scenario. Donald Trump has launched a new social media app called Truth Social. The new US-based networking site says it's free from political discrimination. The former president has launched the app, having been banned from several mainstream social media platforms. Twitter, for example, said the president was permanently suspended due to the risk of further incitement of violence following the attack on the US Capitol in January last year. You're now up to date here on GB News, but on your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. Shortly, we'll be back to the briefing with Gloria.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate.
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. The Prime Minister will be announcing his Living with COVID plan for England later today. The legal requirement to self-isolate looks set to be ditched, and free lateral flow kits for all to be phased out. Joining me in the studio is Scott Benson, Conservative MP for Blackpool South. There's clearly something going on in Cabinet this morning, because Cabinet was supposed to meet to sign off the plan, and then Cabinet was cancelled or delayed till this afternoon. It is reported that there's a bit of a row going on over the cost of mass lateral flow testing and what we can afford as a country. Where do you stand on how much mass lateral flow testing we should be doing?
Good afternoon, Gloria. Mass lateral flow testing is an interesting point. As the Prime Minister made clear yesterday, we're spending £2 billion every single month on testing at the moment. And to put that into context, that's almost the same as a policing budget for a whole year. So that's clearly unsustainable going forward. And as COVID starts to diminish in terms of a threat to public health, I think it's only right we reevaluate the situation and see whether or not we can afford that as a country. But I think, as the Prime Minister will lay out later on, COVID hasn't gone away. People still need to be on their guard and to be responsible, but I think there are different ways of doing things without necessarily having the current arrangements in place on testing, which costs the country a fortune.
Do you know what caused that delay? Is there some last-minute rows going on in Cabinet?
I'm not quite sure, Gloria, to be honest. I'm in exactly the same position as you. I mean, there's so much going on in the world with Ukraine and Russia. I think it's entirely probable the Prime Minister's attention has maybe been drawn to a development as far as national security in Ukraine goes. My understanding is the Cabinet are fully behind these plans, as indeed is the wider parliamentary party. Conservative MPs like me have been crying out for months and months to an end to some of these COVID restrictions, and I'm delighted that it looks like we're going in this direction, but obviously we need to await full details of a statement later on today.
What do you say to those people who say this is a political decision, not a scientific decision, to end all COVID restrictions in England?
I think that's complete and utter nonsense. If it was a political decision, the Prime Minister could have done this before Christmas, for argument's sake. So the politics of this hasn't changed. What has changed is the science. So we're seeing hospitalisations decreasing day by day. I think we're 25,000 infections of COVID yesterday, which is a fraction of what it was even just a number of weeks ago. So whether it be hospitalisations, the number of people testing positive, or sadly fatalities, everything is coming in the right direction here. And I think now is the time when people want to move from a position where the government is spoon-feeding people, telling you how to live, when to test, when to stay at home, to people exercising a bit more responsibility and being a bit more grown-up about how we deal with COVID. And I think now is the right time to make that transition.
Do you worry that some workers will fear that their bosses will say, I don't care if you're sick, because there's no sort of legal right to self-isolate, that people who are sick will end up going to work because they're scared of some bad bosses?
Well, I think in the vast majority of workplaces, people have statutory sick pay, so employers have generally been very, very responsible. I know in my own constituency, the vast majority of big businesses are doing all they can to support workers, because it's not in their interest to see an outbreak of COVID on the factory floor. So it'd be quite stupid as an employer to insist that people come back and don't look after them financially if they are unwell to come back into the office or to the factory. So the vast majority of employers are rightly doing the correct thing, but I think we may well see some further guidance from the government in how employers and indeed offices and factories can manage COVID outbreaks. I would expect something on that later on today.
And do you hope to get some more information on those with compromised immunity for whom the vaccine doesn't necessarily work, and how do we protect those people?
I think there's a national conversation here, not just around protecting the vulnerable, but also long COVID as well. So it'd be very foolish to think the pandemic isn't an end today. The government aren't suggesting that at all. People still need to be very vigilant and do the correct thing. And there will be certain groups in society where further support is needed. So those who are vulnerable, those who are maybe shielding at various points over the last 2 years as well. And I think it would be right for the government to continue to support those people, as well as, for example, offering additional monies to look into long COVID as a condition and how we can better treat that and welcome some of those people back into the workplace and to make sure they can do the things that they've missed over the last few years.
The Labour Party suggests that the government should publish the scientific advice on which today's decision is based. Isn't that a reasonable request? Should we see the science?
Well, at various points over the last 2 years, we have relied upon the science and all that data hasn't necessarily been published. So I think the government have set a precedent here. If we'd been open and transparent all the way through and data was published routinely, then it would be unusual not to publish data at this stage. Clearly, the Labour Party are going to have their own ideas on this. I mean, let's not forget, it's only 8 weeks ago the Labour Party were pushing for a full lockdown and they turned their position on that pretty quickly. So, again, I think there is an argument for being open and transparent here, but people can read different things into data, of course, Gloria. So the government have made what I would consider to be the right call today, and I think many of your viewers will have a sigh of relief. We finally bringing to an end this COVID nightmare and moving on as a country.
And we all want to move on. We all want this to be over.
Very badly.
Now, SAGE have said, and they present different scenarios, but of course the worst case scenario is that the virus could mutate and be far more dangerous than Omicron is. Can you imagine a situation where we could ever end up back in a situation where we're locking down, closing schools, all those things that we did at the start of this nightmare?
I would hope not, as we all would. And let's not forget, of course, it was only September, October. We had a brilliant summer. The economy was booming. The restrictions were all repealed. And then, of course, we edged closer to Christmas and the development of this new variant, which again set us back once again. So it's not beyond the realms of possibilities that we could be in this position again. And I would expect, I think Boris hinted at this yesterday, that some emergency legislation would be left on the statute books to allow the government to have an urgent response if indeed we were faced with a situation of a new variant. But who knows, quite frankly. So I'm just, along with the rest of the scientific population and politicians, hoping that this is an end to the nightmare we've all endured for the last 2 years.
Absolutely. Final question. If the Prime Minister is fined for breaking lockdown rules, would his position as Prime Minister be untenable?
Not necessarily, but of course it's an entirely hypothetical situation. We are awaiting the full police report coming back. I think there's an argument about what, of course, that may well entail, but let's not prejudge that and let's let events take their natural course and then evaluate that in the cold light of day. But what I do know is the Prime Minister enjoys considerable support. I was out knocking on doors on Friday and Saturday, and the vast majority of people were talking to me about the cost of living and other domestic issues, such as seeing their GP. So I think the longer Partygate is out of the headlines, the more people are able to move on. But let's see what that police report finally says.
Conservative MP Scott Benton, always a pleasure to talk to you. We'll be talking later after the show because we're going to record a real me, and I'm really looking forward to doing that
Gloria.
with you. Thank you. Now, we tend to think of seagulls just being by the seaside. The clue is in the name, after all, but they are increasingly venturing inland and can cause all sorts of problems. A new licensing regime was introduced last year by Natural England, which meant local authorities have to submit an application for a licence to deal with urban seagulls, making it harder to control numbers. Joining me now is Vera Hobhouse, Liberal Democrat MP for Bath, and her constituent, Tim Newark. Welcome to the show, both of you. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you.
Tim, how did you end up working with Vera? This is a sort of item that we do each week called Constituency Surgeries, where we explore the work that MPs and their constituents can do together. So tell me how you came to work together, Tim.
Well, the fact was that Natural England had just was not responding to the concerns of Bath residents and their councillors, who you'd have thought would be the people to talk to government. But Natural England just weren't responding. They didn't take seriously our concerns. We were woken up at 5 o'clock every morning by the screeching of gulls and the mess they leave. So I was very thankful when Vera got involved and spoke to the DEFRA minister.
Vera, over to you. Tell me what sort of dangers, I guess, that seagulls can present to your constituents? I was reading that they can attack people and pets. Just explain the cases that you have come across.
Well, the main problem is that seagulls are competing ultimately with humans over food and habitat. And while we respect wildlife, and Tim does that too, it has to be the right balance between human interest and the interest of protecting wildlife. So they are very noisy birds. If you live in central Bath, you will know that the seagulls will wake you up, particularly in the summer, every morning. They take your food if they fancy it. Their fecus is actually dangerous, particularly to children, if it lands in the garden on their toys and so on and so forth. So it's a really considerable public health issue here. And while Bathonians have learned to live with gulls, they're there, and in many other cities the gulls are there too, the new licensing regime has meant that really the gull population is even increasing even further. And at some point, Natural England needed to listen, and Tim was a very active constituent who just didn't let go. So these sort of things always work in partnership.
And Vera, you talk about the need to strike the right balance when it comes to seagulls. What is the right balance in your view? I'll ask the same question to you, Tim, after.
Well, I certainly think that now the balance is completely wrong, because the destruction of nests, which is the only way how we can control urban gull population, is now almost impossible. So I think the council had the ability to destroy just under 2 handfuls of, or if that, nests. Previously, it was well over 100. In fact, the council always has to go back to the same sites because they're quite persistent, these birds. They go back. So basically, the council could do almost nothing. And that is just simply not good enough. The control of urban gulls has to be effective enough to keep the population, while certainly not growing as much as it currently does.
And Tim, do you have anything to add to what Vera has just said on that?
Yes, I think Vera's right that the balance is completely wrong now, that gulls have more rights than the people living in Bath. So I think it's very important that the residents work with the council, which is what is starting now, to protect our roof spaces from nesting gulls with netting and spikes. And to just get the balance right. I mean, it seems Natural England, if we don't like it, they say we should move. But I don't think it's fair I should leave this family house I've lived in for 40 years just because of gulls have started to nest. So it's I think the law needs to favour people more than the actual gulls.
Tim, that's extraordinary. So you've actually... I mean, I think everyone would agree that you shouldn't have to move house, but it's actually so bad that you've had to consider.
Yeah.
Just tell us.
Yeah, it's the noise. The screeching of gulls is extraordinarily loud. It wakes us up at between 4 and 5 o'clock each summer morning. You can't sit outside in your backyard because of all the mess. It makes living in the centre of Bath not much fun, and I've enjoyed that for years. My family's lived in this house for 40 years, but it's getting to the point when I'm not looking forward to the summer now. And indeed, the Natural England just doesn't seem to care. It's just, well, if you don't like it, go. And I'm not going to leave this house because of the seagulls.
And Vera, where next for the campaign? What more are you able to do?
So we have achieved that at least Natural England is listening to us. We had a meeting with Natural England and the DEFRA Minister, Rebecca Powell. She was also actually very sympathetic. And I think Natural England is at least starting to listen and wants to work with the council in order to make the regime work, the new licensing regime. It has to be said, it didn't work at all. So a lot more tweaking of what is currently in place has to happen. What worries me most is even if we tweak it even further, we won't have the same amount of control as we had before. And those who have been plagued by gulls for more than the last 2 years, indeed, sort of 10, 20 years, and have already thought that there were too many gulls in the cities. And they see that the gull population is now even increasing because of this new regime. And fair enough, Natural England had to do that because the government was taken to court and lost that court case over a wildlife organization, which made it very difficult for Natural England not to change the licensing regime. But there has to be a better balance, and currently we still have a long way to go.
Tim and Vera, thank you for bringing the issue of seagulls to our constituency surgery today. Thank you very much. Good to talk to you both. Now, MPs are back in Westminster. The Prime Minister will be announcing the removal of COVID restrictions in England this afternoon, and there are signs of an escalation by Russia in the crisis over Ukraine. Another busy week ahead in Parliament. And here with the very latest is our political correspondent, Tom Howard. Tom, what can you bring us?
Well, we now have confirmation when the Prime Minister will announce to the Commons, and by implication the country, about what exactly will be part and parcel of the removal of COVID restrictions. How much free testing will remain? When will this officially come into force? What will the entire roadmap of living with COVID look like? That will be at the Commons, at the dispatch box in the House of Commons at 4:30 this afternoon. So, all this wrangling that we've been hearing about earlier today about whether or not the Department for Health and the Treasury agree with the particular retention of which bits of testing or bits of surveillance, all of that will have to be sorted out by 4:30, because that's when the Prime Minister will be on his feet in the Commons. And then, after a session of questions from MPs, he'll be back in Downing Street to take questions from journalists at around 6:30 or 7 this evening, and he'll be standing alongside Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance for the first time in months.
We haven't seen them for a while, have we? You mentioned the wrangling that's been reported this morning. Is it still going on, as far as you understand it? Just tell us a little bit about what the fundamentals of that argument is.
The fundamentals are that the Treasury is reluctant to fund as much testing as the Department for Health wants. Now, testing is a very expensive thing to do. We often hear about the billions and billions of pounds that have been spent on the test and trace budget. Well, not much of that's gone to tracing. Most of that's gone on testing. It's expensive to sequence tests, to have all this infrastructure, the PCRs and even the lateral flows, which look like little cheap things. But the millions that have been sent out, it cost around £9 billion in the first year. And of course, in the second year, even more were sent out. So probably a larger bill for the taxpayer. That's what the Treasury is concerned about. But the view of the Health Department is that if you wind down mass testing, it's very hard to start up again were there to be a problem. And surveillance is one of the ways that we know if there were to be a problem. It gives us a bit of an advanced warning system. So that's the row. No doubt there'll be some sort of compromise, but when there is a compromise, then it will go to Cabinet. There'll be the whole Cabinet discussion and sign-off, and then Boris Johnson will stand on his feet in the House of Commons. So that's the three-stage process that needs to happen. And of course, until there's agreement between the Treasury and the Health Department, as far as we understand, Cabinet will not go ahead. So the timing's pretty tight.
And it's a busy afternoon in Parliament, so MPs return from their over a week break. Parliament starts at 2:30 with defence questions. Then there's a number of statements. Before that statement, there's a statement on the Ukraine. Any updates that we might expect there?
Well, it's interesting. The Prime Minister's official spokesman has told assembled journalists this afternoon that Putin's plan is, in effect, already in action. Now, that doesn't mean that war has begun, but that means that Putin's plan for war, as the West understands it, is already in motion. We've seen that with the amassing of troops and artillery and field hospitals on the border of Ukraine, but that seems to have ramped up in recent days, far from what the Kremlin was saying at the start of last week, that there was somehow a withdrawal or a winding down. Quite the opposite appears to have taken place. And so Number 10 is particularly concerned about this and says that the UK stands ready to act.
And briefly, if you would, when Parliament broke up for that little break, lots of talk about the Prime Minister's future. It feels much calmer now. Is that real?
I think it certainly is. Ultimately, MPs are thinking about other things. When there's big issues on the table, whether it's COVID, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's even the storms that we're seeing at the moment, that's what occupies MPs' inboxes more. That's not to say this has gone away in its entirety, but the moment of danger will come if there's any publication from the Metropolitan Police, or perhaps after those local elections on the 5th of May. If the Tories take a drubbing, potentially leadership will be back up to the fore.
Tom Howard, thank you so much. You've been watching The Briefing with me, Gloria De Piero. Thank you, as ever, for your company. I'm back every Monday to Thursday from noon. Up next, it's On the Money with Liam Halligan. But first, let's see just how windy it is where you are.
Hello. Storm Franklin is clearing away, but we do still have a Met Office yellow warning in place until the early afternoon. Still very windy out there and still the potential for damaging gusts through the late morning, early afternoon. There is that storm system starting to ebb away and the isobar is just slowly opening out. So the winds will continue to ease through the rest of today, but it's still going to be a very windy day. For many, it'll be bright out there this afternoon. Quite a bit of cloud over the Midlands, East Anglia through the early afternoon. A few showers likely here, but otherwise it is mostly dry and many places